Success in business is not about not taking risks. Success in business is about managing those risks. So the starting point for investment is where. And that starts with, in the case of rental properties, is the state that you're investing in landlord friendly? If it is not, and you're doing anything other than wholesaling, where you get a property under contract but actually never own it, you just assign it to the ultimate buyer. Other than that, if the state is not landlord friendly, you should stay away from it. Why? All you need is one bad tenant who decides, this is California, this is New York.
And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset of the Mentoring podcast. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most talked about things in real estate market is Canada versus US. Where should we be putting our money? And if you're a real estate investor and you're investing in Canada and you're looking at cap rates of 3.5, 4 caps, you're thinking, how do I get to this sweet, sweet cash flow? And you start looking a little bit south of the border and you see 6, 7, 8, 10 caps. And you're thinking, man, that looks so interesting. But what do I do about the taxes? What do I do about the corporate structure? We have the man, the myth, the legend. We've got Michael Matthew here to talk about us. He wrote a book, A to Zen Real Estate, Peace of Mind Strategies for the Canadian Investor. And Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
So one of the things that I really pride myself in is really pushing forth getting into a state of action. And I believe that massive imperfect action beats perfect planning. Now, in your book, you talk about improper planning leads to paying too much in tax and exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. How do we balance massive imperfect action with the perfect planning?
It's all about trade-offs. As you said, you could just plan and plan and plan forever, but without action, you're never going to get anywhere. And if you just spring into action with zero planning whatsoever, you could end up costing yourself lots of headaches and lots of money by doing things in the incorrect fashion. So you have to have a mix of both, I think, is really the secret.
Now, I know one of the things that you are really a huge fan of is the CCC structure for Canadians. Talk to me a little bit of what that means so that we can get people to understand what CCC means for an investor.
Sure. That's the term that I've created in order to explain the basic setup structure for investing in U.S. real estate. That starts with creating a Canadian corporation that owns a Wyoming C Corporation, which owns an LLC in whatever state you're invested in. So let's just say it's in Florida as an example. The reason for this is you have to avoid the mistakes that people make when they're investing across the border. LLCs are a very common investment vehicle in the US. They're so common, I sometimes think you can get one from the bottom of the cereal box. But that's not something that Canadians should ever own directly, hence the intervening corporations. Why? If you're a US resident and you own real estate through an LLC, you have the protection of a corporation when it comes to legal liability. But I think it's something like 99% of the time, the way you actually pay your taxes is you flow that income and expense from your rental business, let's say, to your personal US tax return. And as a US resident, that's the end of the story. You're fine. As a Canadian resident, however, it gets trickier. You can do that first part the same way. Set up an LLC, flow it through to your US personal tax return. But you also have to file on the Canadian side. As a Canadian resident, you're required to report income worldwide from whatever source, from whatever country on your personal tax return. So given that you've already filed your US personal tax return in this scenario, you're going to want to claim the tax that you paid as a foreign tax credit on your Canadian return because you don't want to pay the same tax twice, obviously. Now, the problem with that is CRA will say, okay, you're trying to claim these tax credits. Where are they coming from? Well, I paid this on my foreign, in this case, US personal tax return. Okay, but where's that coming from? I had this LC that owned the real estate and it had income and expenses, and they go, whoa, 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 whoa. So you're saying that these credits come ultimately from a corporation, an LLC. Yeah, but it's a flow through to my personal tax return in the US. And CRA says, I don't understand what you just said. Essentially, they do not recognize the flow through aspects of the LLC. They treat it solely as a corporation, which means you're trying to claim corporate foreign tax credits against personal income in Canada. You have a mismatch. They're not the same level. And so,
so when you look at that and you think, okay, so I've got, let's look at, first of all, I want to start to just set up the structures. We've got in Canada, we've got a Canadian company or an individual owning the company in the US. And what we're saying is a Canadian corporation owning a US company is a better structure. Now, the US companies, there's the different structures. You've got an LLC, you've got a C Corp, you've got an S Corp, you've got these different entities that you can use. And you're saying the LLC, because it's a limited liability corporation, it's flow through mechanism to a personal on the side. If you want to, you're looking at liquidating, you're trying to take the income out. If you leave it in the LLC, do you still get the same exposure?
people don't leave it in the LLC. Theoretically, you could, but then you would have it in a corporation and CRA would deem that any income there to be paid to you as a dividend personally, which means you'd still have to pay the tax and you'd have no hope of claiming the tax credits again.
Now, whereas if you have, so the LLC, can the LLC be owned by a Canadian corporation?
It can, but I don't recommend it. When you have a second U.S. corporation, in this case a C Corp, owning that LLC, you can then flow through from the LLC to that C Corp. Now it's all within the U.S., so there's no withholding taxes, there's no cross-border stuff. And with this structure, you could have, say, 3 properties each and 10 different LLCs around the country. And the only entity that files income taxes in the US in this whole scenario of 30 different properties is your C corporation, because everything flows from the LLC up to the C Corp. And this is the one that files the taxes.
And then that C Corp, if you own it personally, you still have the same problems of the cross border. And that's why you're talking about a corporation owning the C Corp.
Yes, but there's a further issue, which is if you own it through a corporation, as I suggested, the way it works is there's something called foreign accrual property income, or FAPI, FAPI. It's a horrible name, but I didn't come up. So don't blame me. I don't like it myself.
We're going to talk about FAPI, guys, and let your just mind go nuts on that one.
Yeah. And the issue with that is if you bring back 100% or 0% of that rental income from the US physically, CRA is nice enough to tax you as if you brought back 100%. A lot of people think if I don't bring it back, they don't tax it. That's not true if it's considered to be what we call passive income, which in this case, we're talking about rental income. So long-term rents, that sort of thing. But just the mechanism of this tax, without getting into all the details, is such that if you have it coming back to a corporation in Canada and you've paid 25% or more foreign tax, you pay no additional tax in Canada. So the federal corporation rate in the US is currently 21%. Florida, as the example we talked about, it's 5.5%. So 21 plus 5.5, 26.5% total, which is, and I don't think I have to consult my calculator, more than 25. So what that means, if you pay state income tax of 4% or more on this type of income, you pay no additional tax in Canada. However, if you as an individual own that C Corp, you would have to pay more than, I think it's 50, almost 55% foreign tax to not pay more tax in Canada.
Is it just because they look at the largest like marginal tax bracket and say it's got to be more than that, or
It's just the mechanism of this FAPI tax. There's a factor that they multiply the tax you paid by, and it's a larger factor. In fact, it's 4 for corporate owned properties all the way through, which means 25% times 4 is 100%. You get 100% reduction in your tax liability. Otherwise, you get a fraction of that. So the late, not so great Justin Trudeau proposed to change that. And rather than having the individual factor go up to match the corporate factor, he decided to drop the corporate factor to the individual, which means you'll always pay more tax on foreign rental income in Canada, no matter what. However, when Parliament was prorogued, that particular legislation died on the order paper.
yeah, it looked like it was pushed off to 2026 or something, wasn't it?
No, that was complete withdrawn. I think you're thinking of the capital gains inclusion
Maybe
rate,
I'm thinking about the capital gains. Yeah.
which were pushed off to 2026. There's other things they've done related to real estate in a similar fashion. For instance, Bear Trust reporting. They pushed that off to 24, and now they pushed it off by another year. They will never say this is a horrible idea. We didn't know what we're doing. We drafted it quickly and we're going to abandon it, which is the honest thing. Instead, they just say, oh, it's still good. It's still good. We're just going to push it off a year.
Got to justify the account.
Unfortunately, so many of their measures, I have this perhaps somewhat cynical view of they're just terrified of you earning $1 of income and then them not knowing about it. Because with this Bear Trust reporting, with this foreign asset reporting, it's not tied to income, because the whole point of a Bear Trust is a Bear Trust has no income, ever. It's impossible to have income. That's why you set it up that way. It's our version of flow through, frankly. And you always have an obligation to report even $1 of income from whatever source earned in the year. So this is just additional paperwork that has to be done, and it's going to generate income for them because people don't know about all these extra filing requirements necessarily, and they fine you for every day you're late with the paperwork up to a certain maximum, whatever it is. And to me, it's just a burdening the taxpayer with extra paperwork, which literally brings them no tax revenue.
It's like it's like the what is it? The unused housing filing that has to happen that's coming up, and most people don't even know about it, and they're going to get dinged.
They're going to get dinged, and I know Toronto had a huge issue with that. And
Well, they
so,
deferred it. They deferred it.
yeah, but this was something that was so important it had to be done, and they had a certain deadline, and then something like 25% of the people affected didn't file. And so I said, oh, well, just kidding about the deadline. We'll let you file it late with no penalty. So if you're letting people file late with no penalty, how crucial was it to for it to be put in place in the first place? I'd say not very. It's just one of these things that sounds good, and unfortunately, the politicians can pass laws without thinking them through. There's no requirement that they get a report. Okay, what are the consequences of what you're saying? On the Bear Trust, quickly, if grandma opens up a savings account for little junior when he's born and puts money into it every month, by the time he's 18, so here's your savings account, little Johnny, you can now pay for college. By that time, if it's hit over 50 grand, which over, say, 17, 18 years is certainly possible, it's now a reportable trust. Do you think grandma knows that? Do you think Johnny knows that? No, of course not. And so they drafted this legislation so quickly that, and vaguely, that the professional accountants were saying, okay, you do realize that your legislation will catch this exact type scenario.
It's one of my probably my biggest irks when I look at legislation, especially in recent changes, and we see this in a lot of the governing bodies, whether it's RICO, FISRA, or anything that's in the real estate space, is they've migrated away from prescriptive based legislation to principles based legislation, which is all interpretive. And which means that there's nothing but just penalties just sitting over your shoulder if they interpret it differently than you do. Do you see that in the tax code?
There's certainly vagueness that's done deliberately. So, for instance, this is a law that Trudeau did pass, which is the house flipping rule, anti-house flipping rule, in fact. What it said was if you buy a house, your principal residence, as your principal residence, and sell it in less than a year, unless it falls under one of these exceptions would be something like, I got a new job, I had to relocate to a different part of the country, I had a baby, I had to get a bigger house, that sort of thing. Barring one of those exceptions, you're automatically not going to be able to claim your principal
Gains
residence exemption, nor is it going to even be a capital gain situation. It's going to be 100% taxable income, like you are in the business of buying and selling homes. So that's something that there was a perceived abuse, and they enacted legislation to attack that. So people say, okay, what's the magic number? 1 year. Okay, I'll wait 1 year plus a day, then sell the house. The problem with that is now you're into the old system, which is CRA can attack it at any point and say, yeah, we don't think that was really your principal residence. You're going to have to prove it because we think you're just house flipping. And that's why under the old system, which still applies after the 1 year, it's up to them to interpret if you've, quote, lived in it long enough. And if they said, okay, if you lived in it for 2 years, that's considered long enough and you can claim the principal residence exemption. Well, people that want to do that will have a lot of 2-year homes in their history because they'll know exactly what the line is. They don't want to draw the line that clearly because people will plan accordingly.
Well, and to be honest, when you look at residential real estate, I think the average tenure for a first-time home buyer in their first house is 3 to 5 years. And so I mean, to say that half of that, is what the number you're going to use is ridiculous, or a third of that is ridiculous for the government to look at it that way. And yes, there's going to be people who are flipping houses. You might buy a house, you might renovate and then sell it. And you've now improved a property and inventory and given a great home for somebody else. And I think there's a lot of positivity that happens in that space that really got ignored in that whole process.
And then they wonder why there's a shortage of housing and rental housing in particular.
Yep. Yeah, there was a study done. I was at an event. It was a Wealth Genius event, which is a real estate group up here in Canada. And they were talking about a guy by the name of Thomas Larini came up and he was talking about, he did a study on every single state. And what he found is the rents that were the most affordable were in the states that had the least amount of rent control. Rents that were the most expensive were in the states that had the most amount of rent control. And so does rent control propagate a better rental situation for the tenant? And the numbers tell you no. Do you agree with him?
Absolutely. I know at one point we were looking at converting a building that we had planned for condominiums to rental units. And when the owner sat down and did the math, he said, there's just no way because you cannot command sufficient rent in the market to come near to the profit you can make from selling these things as condos, right? A quality builder and what they say, location, location, location. It's in a desirable spot for people to live. You're going to almost, the math I've seen in the current environment, which does have rent control, you have to sell it as condos to make money. If you're going to sell it as purpose-built rental, you need some concessions from the government. I know there's been a proposal, I don't believe it's been passed into law, that if you start building rental homes under a certain price, they're going to waive the HST, which makes it somewhat affordable, but the development charges are a huge component. if they really were serious about having more housing created, they would just not charge development charges. I
Well,
know.
in Kitchener-Waterloo, Barry Verbradnik, I always say his last name wrong, put forth a proposal, and it was passed where they gave a lot of reprieve for builders over a specific period of time to submit and get permits approved for a massive amount of large-scale multifamily. And whether it was condo or rental, I think there was, at the time when I was on the Heritage Committee, it was like 36, you know, condos were or massive structures were put into place that year that wouldn't have hit the table if it wasn't the case. And then the second that you pull that off, now there's a big pause, and especially when there's a shift in the economic landscape of the country.
What a lot of consumers don't really understand is when you're selling a condo or selling a home, an individual home for that matter, there's a locked-in sale price. So when the price of materials quadruples, as lumber did during the pandemic, as a home builder, you just have to eat that. There's no other way around it. So to have that uncertainty, which you're contractually bound by, and then to have this huge amount of development charges on top of that, it's really discouraging. And I work for a home builder, so I know we're not making 50, 70, 100% return. We're lucky to net 20.
Yeah, and when you look at most business tax returns, if you're a reasonable business, you want to be running better than that. So should builders not be expecting the same level of return as, Joe the plumber or Sally who runs a nail salon? I think they should be able to demand a return for the time that's being spent.
And it's an interesting business to be sure. Right now, we have trades sort of contacting us, say, hey, us drywallers, we're looking for work. Electricians, plumbers, painters, we're all looking for work. We're ready to go. We'll give you a good price. The problem is the demand just isn't there yet. And then when the market is hot and people are buying right, left, and center, you can't find a contractor because they're all busy on other jobs.
Well, that's that. I mean, I had a guy who came on my podcast who's out of, I think he was Milwaukee. He was doing a lot of work up there, and he talked a lot about how he's taking his business and vertically integrating all of his trades, which, I mean, there's a lot of advantage to that. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happen through a lot of the, people I talk to on my podcast. But there's also inertia that needs to happen. And because if you integrate all your trades, you need deal flow. And if you don't have deal flow, you're dead in the water.
Yes, and this is why I noticed when I was living downtown, there'd be a condo that would start and then would just stall because they didn't get the sales. They didn't have a proper reserve fund in case prices went up, like as I mentioned earlier. And so it would just stall out and then for years. Then I turn around and all of a sudden it's finished. What happened? A second builder came along, bought out the first builder who went bankrupt, pennies on the dollar. And because he had such a low buy-in, he had more than enough margin to complete the work.
Yeah, and we've seen that happen quite a bit where we get these cash flow plans from people who want to build through our mortgage business and for commercial construction. And you look at their cash flow plan and no contingencies, no provisions for cost of capital, no provisions for delays in absorption if it's a condo. None of these things built into the whole process. They just assume it's going to be a best case scenario. And I think that's one thing that you really talk about is contingency, is building contingency into how you run your business from a real estate investment perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're getting into either construction or renovation, there's certainly a critical path methodology that has to be followed. As an example, you can't have the drywaller come in, seal up all the walls before the electrical and the plumbing is put in, because otherwise you're doing that twice. And what happens if the electrical team is busy? Well, that delays the drywaller because he can't come in until the electricians are done their work. And if you don't build in a factor for contingency, I think you're just showing that you're not really a professional about it, because I don't know any project that there's not some delay here and there for some reason. And you have to allow that. You have to have some room to let out the pants, as a friend of mine says, that it's going to take you longer than you thought. So I know we always say if we think their bill's going to take 6 months, we tell the client, be ready to close in 9. And there'll be a certain amount of people that'll be thrilled if we're done in 7. But there's also some say, can you delay it another month? Because they haven't put their finances together, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, and that's always a challenge, whether you're doing vertical builds or even horizontal builds, where you're laying out say a plan of subdivision or something like that, and you're looking to sell off those lots, and maybe the one builder isn't finished, their phase 1 at their other, so they're not ready to move to phase 2, and so they can't really get things going, so they're not ready to absorb in those properties, and you've got to have contingency for that.
absolutely, it's just part of being a professional and planning accordingly.
Now,
It's what has to be done. That's all. That's the business that we're in.
when we get back to the idea, and I want to focus a little bit more again of Canadians investing in the US, because I think it's, again, looking at cap rates, cap rates are more interesting. In a lot of the asset classes down in the US, the scale is more interesting. When you look at the size and scope of some of the projects in the US, I know one of the things that you really hone in on is, the right structure is your shield is something that you talk about. And the first thing you do is when you talk about, and you mentioned a little bit earlier, is when you talk about your C Corp, is setting up your C Corp in Wyoming. And I know a lot of people talk about Delaware. There's some conversations around Nevada and some of these other places for setting up a C Corp based on what happened with Elon in Delaware. And so, why Wyoming?
You mentioned the 3 states that I hear talked about. I'd have to think if I ever heard a 4th one. Wyoming is now the clear favorite, unless you're in the type of business that the exit plan is to go public. Delaware's laws are set up to make that way easier to do. But given the type of clients I work with, that's not on the table. And Wyoming is preferred. It's cheaper than Texas. They have good asset protection laws. They have good privacy laws, and everything is fully automated now. So you're able to work fairly quickly to set things up. Some of the states still have manual intervention. Let's put it that way. That slows it down. And it has no state income tax, which from the real estate perspective would only be relevant if you had real estate in Wyoming, but that's also a benefit of some sort. And that's where all my clients, frankly, set up their C corporation. And with that C corporation, you set up one and you can feed as many LLCs into it as you like, depending on your preference for risk versus cost, right? Because obviously, theoretically, you could put all your properties in one LLC, but if there was a legal issue with one of them, then all the other properties are potentially at risk. And that usually comes down to a valuation issue. As an example, I looked at buying 5 houses in Ohio. The total asking price was $230,000. I had no issue putting all 5 of those in one LLC. As by contrast, those same properties in Canada would have been worth over 1.1 million each in US dollars at the time. You're looking at 5.5 million. There's not a chance I would put all that in one corporation. It's just too much of a risk. Now, with every new setup of an LLC, obviously you have creation costs, you have maintenance costs, but you have to weigh what's your peace of mind worth. Some people say, you know what, I've got insurance. I think that's going to be good enough. It's not, but that's what they think. And I'll just roll the dice. I don't think I'll have a problem. Everything's in one. Other people say, you know what, I had a bad experience with one property being a problem, even though it's more costly to do so. I'm going to have one property in one LLC, and every other property is going to be in its own LLC, because that way nothing else is affected. There's no cross contamination. The reality is most people will pick a point somewhere in between, typically based on the valuation of the properties as a whole.
Yeah, when you look at the exposure, what are some of the things if you have, like you say, those 5 properties in a single LLC? I mean, what risks are we talking about here?
You have the risk of any debtor taking you to court and getting a determination you owe them money. And if you don't pay it, potentially they could seize your property. The one most likely to do that is the municipality. If you don't pay your property taxes, eventually they can and will seize your property and sell it at an auction, typically, to recover what's owed. That's usually a small thing. The bigger thing is everyone seems to have at least one idiot friend, in my experience. You have an idiot friend that comes over and decides that it'd be a good thing to do to jump out of the second story window of your property just for fun. Of course, they break their arm. Now they sue you. They sue their friend who is the tenant. And if you had more than that property in the LC, then those other properties would potentially be at risk. And so that's something you have to weigh. And
Now,
as
is that why, one of the things you emphasize in the A to Zen real estate book is around keeping your assets off the radar, and specifically why you focus on Wyoming?
yeah, that's part of it, right? So that they have this charging order system where if your Wyoming company cannot be sued because it's not public facing, right? All it does is own the LLCs. That's it. But theoretically, let's say somehow it was, if you lose the case, all that people can do is sit there like this with their hands out waiting for you to take money out of the corporation. And if you don't, they get nothing.
So there's no enforcement.
There's enforcement, but what they can't do is go inside your company to take it. You have to be distributing money from your company in order for them to be able to take it. It's called the charging order system,
And that's specific to Wyoming?
specific to Wyoming.
Interesting. Interesting.
But again, that's really not an issue because you're doing things in the name of your LLCs. You're not doing things in the name of your Wyoming corporation. So there's no real, it's called nexus in law, NEXUS. There's no connection of that Wyoming corporation to you as the alleged plaintiff in this case.
Interesting. Now, say you got the right structure, you've got your triple C structure on your corporation, you've got, you're keeping everything off the radar, you're positioned right. Now you're ready to go out and buy the real estate. Success begins with doing your homework before you invest is another thing that you talk about. And the other thing you say is a good deal leaves you room to breathe. Now, how can you keep those two things in mind while again realizing that without action, we don't get results?
Success in business is not about not taking risks. Success in business is about managing those risks. So the starting point for investment is where. And that starts with, in the case of rental properties, is the state that you're investing in landlord friendly? If it is not, and you're doing anything other than wholesaling, where you get a property under contract but actually never own it, you just assign it to the ultimate buyer. Other than that, if the state is not landlord friendly, you should stay away from it. Why? All you need is one bad tenant who decides, this is California, this is New York, this is New Jersey. I can live here a year rent free or more before you're able to kick me out. And there's nothing you can do about it. They also have these ridiculous squatting laws. There's a case where a lady was on vacation for months in Europe, came back to find someone squatting in her house, and the cops were called by the supposed tenant who produced a forged lease agreement, and the cops took her away. That's just the way they roll there. And it's not something that's worth taking on because the risk is just too great. By contrast, I was on a call with someone from Texas and they apologized because if the tenant misses a rent payment, you have to wait a whole 3 weeks before you can start the paperwork to evict them. And living in Ontario where we do, just to get a hearing before the landlord-tenant board, that usually takes a year. And then when you show up and you get an order to have them removed because they haven't paid the rent, there's no defense for that. It's not like they're out the next day. The police, actually, a lot of people don't know this, the police cannot evict a tenant out of your premises. The only party who's legally entitled to evict people physically, if necessary, is the sheriff. And so you have to schedule an appointment with the sheriff, and then the sheriff will then go put a notice on the tenant's door saying you have up until this date to vacate. Otherwise, I will vacate you. And most people, of course, they don't want a confrontation, so they'll just move out the day before the sheriff shows up. But that takes months, and this is after you not getting paid for a year or more.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot in Canada where, people have gone on for, I think the worst I ever saw was, from clients that I work with, was 13, 14 months before they were able to actually get vacant possession of their own property.
Right.
I've seen real estate transactions where vacant possession was promised and not delivered because the tenant decided to change their mind and decided to stay. And, there's a lot of challenge that happens with that. And that all comes at a cost. And where there's costs like that, that increase the cost for the investor. And whereas the investor is only doing it for the purposes of financial gain, because that's what an investment is to pay you more than you pay into it. It then invariably makes it more expensive for the people who just want a great home and do good things.
All it does is it restricts the housing supply, because now, having gone through that experience, if you decide to stay in the landlord business, you're going to have now these complex, lengthy tenant applications, and you're going to jack up the rent as much as you can. Why? Because you have to recover for that lost amount of rent that wasn't paid by the previous tenant who decided that they really didn't want to pay. And that's really a problem. So by starting with that point and looking at population growth, and also why is the population growing? So for instance, if you're investing in Florida and a community that primarily caters to retired people, and you're not in that business, that may not be the best place to invest, even though the population is growing. However, if you're putting up, say, a seniors residence, that'd be the perfect place to do it. You have plenty of takers. So that's also important. And then you have to evaluate whether this is a good investment in the first place. And that's where our friend, the spreadsheet, comes into play. And what you do is, well, I'm an accountant, so spreadsheets are my friends. I don't know about other people.
I love them.
And what that does is you put in your expected rent and you deduct all your costs, and you have to allow a factor for vacancy. If you're lucky enough to find a tenant within a month, that's great. But I've gone 3, 4 months between tenants, and that time the bank did not call me up and say, you know what, Michael, we understand you don't have a tenant right now. You don't have to pay your mortgage until you do. That doesn't happen. So you have to factor in your unit will not always be occupied. You have to allow for a certain amount of repairs every year, insurance, and so on, and property taxes, of course. And insurance and property taxes, when you're investing in the US, is especially important to have a look at. And if you're investing in single family homes in particular, it's even more so. Reason being, many states have what they call a homestead law, which means when it comes to property taxes, if you're an owner-occupied home, your property taxes are X. If you're an investor-owned home, it could be 2 or 3 times that. And so people will do their due diligence, as they should, and say, okay, Mr. Sellers, send me your last 2 or 3 years worth of property tax bills. And you check that out and say, oh, okay, I know what my property tax will be. You don't unless you've confirmed there is no homestead law. So that one catches a lot of people by surprise.
Yeah, I think there's a similar one like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, in New Brunswick as well, where municipalities will charge a greater degree of tax if it's rental versus owner occupied.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular rule, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. And it does unfortunately surprise investors. And insurance is another one. Given the volatility of the insurance market, you could have your insurance go up, I've heard 5 times the rate. And it's totally unexpected. Just for me personally, as a professional accountant, I have to have professional liability insurance. And my rate went up, I think, by at least a third from one year to the next, maybe even 50%. And I called them up and said, what's going on? And they said, yeah, well, there's a lot of fires out in Fort McMurray that we had to pay out on. Okay.
What has that got to do with me?
My first thought is, do you have to make all your money back just on me? The second thing is, what does burned real estate in Alberta have to do with an accounting practice that's primarily based in Ontario? The answer is nothing, except the same company is involved and they don't want to absorb all those losses. So their clients who had nothing to do with the area of loss are going to have to pay for something that's completely unrelated.
Show me that in the actuarial equation.
It's the only justification is profit, right? They want to maintain a certain profit. And the whole idea of insurance is they pay out a very few amount of claims and they have everyone kicking in the premiums.
Yep. Yeah. It's just it's a form of just protection through taxation, really is what it is. They're taxing you on a routine basis to pay out for that one-time hit. And then if that's a little bit more, they're going to tax everybody to take it a little bit more to pay for that again. And that's why they have the largest buildings in all of the cities that we're in.
That's true.
Because they're a very good job of doing it.
That's true. You want to look at the big buildings, they're either banks or insurance company led.
Well, that tells you something, and I think you're absolutely right. When you're looking at real estate, I think the only time I've personally ever been burned on real estate is when I had bravado, when I got too big for my britches, when I let, I think you say, don't let optimism blind you. I was drunk on cheap money. I was, when that came out and I was high on life because I looked at the data of the recent, but I didn't look at the data of the history. And I didn't realize that, that 40-year low was just right around the corner when I purchased a couple properties and then went, oh my gosh, watch the rates triple and watch the value of properties plummet. And if you don't budget that into your equation and think that that could happen, you're going to be stuck. And especially if you're in the US, because the US volatility is a lot different than the volatility in Canada.
Yes, and you saw that during the downturn in the real estate market from 2008 to about 2012. And, I know one promoter who was lining up Canadians to invest in the US, he had to change his marketing because when he said the truth, which is you could get good properties at 30 cents on the dollar, Canadians didn't believe it, wouldn't show up to his marketing sessions. So when he said it was 70 cents on the dollar, 30% discount, I said, oh yeah, that makes sense. And they'd show up. But because we don't have the volatility in Canada where your property values would drop by 70%. It just doesn't happen.
And I think that was the largest we saw in 40 years. That just happened recently. And it'll be interesting to see how the full recovery goes on that and how that transpires. Because again, it's that difference between the average family income and the cost of real estate that really will show how connected, because that's whether it's going to be paid for through mortgage or paid through rent, somebody's got to pay it. And if they don't have the money to do it, there's going to be delinquencies. They're going to take it and they're not going to pay it, or they're not going to be able to do it and they're going to go somewhere else. And when you look at the states, I was just talking with a friend of mine down in San Antonio, and you can buy a beautiful home that in Canada might cost you 1.5 to 1.6 for $600,000 US, where the average income is $80,000 for that family. And you compare that to Canada, that ratio is it's just not there. And that ratio's got to come back into play. I mean, we've got firefighters, we've got paramedics, cops, teachers, nurses who are integral parts of society that are looking to go buy homes right now and realizing that dream home that they're looking at And it will say a dream starter home that they're looking at is out of reach based on the affordability matrix. And that's got to change.
Yeah, certainly if you look at what you're basically alluding to, the income versus cost of a home, that gap is widened dramatically. I believe my grandfather bought his first house in Canada for 6 months' salary. I wouldn't want to see what I could buy for 6 months' salary in the Toronto area. I mean, you might get a
I don't think you
comp.
get a parking lot. I don't think you get a parking space. I think you might get one in Brampton or something.
Yeah, it's that gap is just it's gone way out of hand, in particularly in the large cities in Canada, Vancouver and Toronto. Vancouver is actually, believe it or not, even more expensive than Toronto, and Toronto is crazy with their prices. I know a client of mine was living just north of Toronto and said, you know what? We got 4 kids. They're all teenagers now. We probably would be better off in a larger house. And she said, the budget, well, 1.5. She couldn't find anything less than 2 million. So I said, our current house isn't so bad. What's the ultimate decision? Let's see if we can spend a few bucks on, fixing this one up a bit, because what's available out there, especially when you have a family of 6, it's very high end now.
100% it is. I mean, when we were kids, to be fair, I came from a family of 6. We still lived in a 3-bedroom home. It just people, we shared a room. Like the 4 boys were in one room, the 2 girls were in the other room, and that's just how you lived. And I know that, there's a little bit of feature creep that happens and in what people are looking for. So the demand of what people require is a little bit different than maybe when I was a kid back in the 80s. And, because they want a little bit more. Everybody's got to have their own bedroom. Now they're like, everybody's got to have their own bedroom and their own bathroom. But, the income doesn't support that. And so there's that disparity that happens. And I think when we go back to the real estate investment side of things, we'll see this happen a lot where people want to get into bigger deals. They want to get into more stable coin style investments of larger multifamily units. And the P word starts coming out, partners. And there's many different ways that people can partner, GPLP, joint venture agreements, all these different structures out there. I know you say that it's critical work of the team that you trust because real estate is a people business. Number one, what structures do you see the most dangerous, and what should people be looking for when they get into these kind of partnership agreements?
Regardless of what structure you ultimately choose, whether it's a joint venture or you set up a corporation together or what have you, the agreement must be a very good one. And you must also live up to that agreement. So I had a client that had a really bad experience because she didn't vet her partners properly. They became partners simply because they're part of the same real estate information group. Now that's a starting point, but you absolutely need to vet your partners the same way you would vet a prospective tenant and get all the background information you need. It turned out to be a very poisonous experience. I saw some of the emails going back and forth. The property has since been sold at a decent profit, and now they're squaring off in court. So it was all because she didn't vet them. And they also had some curious choices. They're both professionally trained accountants. And for some reason, they asked my client, who's substantially older than them and no accounting background, to keep the books, which makes no sense to me. Even if you expect to be paid for keeping the books, that's fine. You agree on a reasonable rate up front. But you have to have a professional draw up your agreement, and you have to stick to it, because when you don't stick to it, that's when problems start arising, because if you don't follow it for long enough, then the agreement, or at least part of it, can become invalid, and then who knows where you are.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges where people they have the one person because everybody's has this dream of they now own 150 multifamily building, and they got in it with completely sweat equity, so they didn't have to put in money because they work at the local gas station and they've got no cash, but they want to own that building and they want the short path to get there. And so they're willing to do whatever it takes, which is great. They've got big visions and big goals, but they don't look at the steps that's required to actually make that come together. And they're going to be the sweat equity partner, and so they start putting out all these cool little chat GPT written slides that some investor decides to, oh, that looks like that person knows what they're doing, and doesn't vet them properly, and then all of a sudden they become an investor into a property with a person who is the working partner, has never done anything in construction in their life, never managed a person in their life, let alone a project. Then that's where it becomes a huge problem.
Right. And it comes back to the vetting process, right? You have to vet your partners, whether you're bringing in the money or, as you said, bringing in the sweat equity. You need to know what they're doing. And you also have to be aware of the governing laws. I know in the US, they can be quite particular when it comes to joint ventures, that if you have someone whose entire involvement is they write a check, they say, get back to me in 5 years when you sell the property, kind of thing. What has happened is the sweat equity partner, the managing partner, just sold a security in violation of SEC guidelines, because you can't have someone who's not involved in some way. It could be you have a 1 hour meeting once a month to update on the project, but people run into trouble because they don't know that that is actually breaking the law by doing what they're doing, where they just take a check. If you're just taking money from people and you're not set up as a proper investment vehicle, then if authorities get a hold of you, you're done.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's where it comes to making sure that you're dealing with the right person giving you advice on the right structure. And if you're the one who's being the investor, you've got to be very cautious. There's a lot of cases that came to fruition, and whether it's just poor timing, because again, it was a 40-year low in Canada where, a lot of these major players in the real estate space completely went illiquid. And I mean, they're already illiquid. They were kiting through, all these prom notes that they would go, and, people were so insatiate, they just fell in love with these prom notes because they would be, 20% posted on the prom note, 25% posted on the prom note. People were like, I'm getting paid. This is amazing. But what they didn't realize is it was just a kiting game. That prom note was paying the prom note that was paying the prom note that was paying for the property. And none of these were securitized. So they were all, demand letters. And so, they could just be dropped because it was just personally guaranteed by a corporation. That was a shell. And so when they ran into problems, all these people had these prom notes, just lost everything. And, I have friends who've lost millions in these situations. I was always against them fundamentally because if you're in real estate and you're putting money, your money should be tied to real estate. I've seen that on the joint venture side as well, where people are the working partner. They have a JV agreement with the money partner who actually owns the property. And then the money partner says, okay, you're done your work. Bye-bye now. And the JV says, but I own the property. No, you don't. I do. See you in court.
Yeah, that can definitely be an issue, and there are steps you can take. Registering caveats on the title would be one of them, but that can create problems with the financing, right? So these things are trade-offs, and a lot of it comes down to what we just discussed, not vetting your partners from the start. And unfortunately, people can get taken advantage of because of that.
Yep. Yep. When you look at the structure, the GPLP structure, what's your, and again, assuming all things being equal, do you see that as probably one of the better structures of all the structures to use if you're raising capital, other than going to setting up a REIT or something more of a formalized structure?
Where I've seen those best used would be in larger projects where you want to take money from people, but you frankly don't want them involved in running the project. Because the way the limited partnership rules operate is you literally are not allowed to manage the project, because if you do, then you're no longer considered a limited partner, you're considered a general partner, meaning any debts or lawsuits of the partnership can fall on you completely. And as you're set up as a limited partner, as yourself, as an individual, which is often the case, now you have no liability protection. And that's definitely not what you want to do. And most people don't do that. But if you're I have a client right now who's, let's see, he's got 6 limited partners. Yeah, 6 limited partners, but he's running the project. There's a general partner set up as a corporation, so that has the liability protection. It gets a small amount. I know specifically in this case, but it's often 1%. They just need to make a tiny profit, pay a little bit of tax, because if they make no money, then CRA could deny all the expenses because you're not a business then if you're not making profit. General partners should make a
So
little
we're
bit.
going to just jack up the interest rates, not make profit, and say it's your fault.
Yeah. So, but it's working out, well so far. They're doing a conversion project of an existing building and making it into residential from a commercial type usage. Yeah, so it works well for that because he wanted to raise funds from people who are looking for a return, but not a job, I guess you'd say.
And that's the one thing people don't realize about when they get into real estate. They call it passive income. And if you own any small properties like a duplex or a triplex or a single family home and you self-manage that, you realize very quickly it is nothing passive about it. There is work that needs to be done. And if you don't have a project manager or property manager on it, and if you do, you're still going to manage the property manager and to make sure that they're doing the right things. So, I mean, it's always going to be work unless you go to that LP structure or you start investing in a fund. And the last one that I know that a lot of people are moving to, I've got a good friend of mine who runs a company, Foundation Capital, and they went from trying to raise capital in the old way to just setting up a fund and getting investors to invest in their fund.
Right, and that is truly passive. A variation on that is the private equity model. So private equity, I can't remember the exact date change, but it was, let's say, 10, 12 years ago, they changed the law. Prior to that, you had to be an accredited investor just to hear about these projects. And they then opened it up that if you were not an accredited investor, you could participate. But they're still very strictly controlled. For instance, there's no open meetings with those presentations. Everyone has to be invited by the organizer. And what that will allow you to do is invest in a project for a much smaller sum. I've seen them, they generally start around 15 to 25,000 and go up. And of course, you can invest more. And those are often backed by real estate. So there's one I'm aware of where they were building a external storage building for people in Vancouver. Vancouver prices are even higher for real estate, as we mentioned. So space is definitely at a premium. And people will often downsize their home, but they don't necessarily downsize their stuff.
Yep.
They have these extra things to store. And so what this private equity deal did was it would pay interest of 8%, 2% per quarter, so 8% for the year. And then at the end of the build, they'd have what they call a kicker, which they can't guarantee because that's a legal statement if you guarantee something. But they say in the past, we paid out kickers in the range of, and basically what they're projecting is an additional, I think it was 12% at the end of the 3 years, which means you're getting a return of 12% a year for 3 years. In that scenario, it's truly passive because you cut a check to the project and you just get your interest back. And at the end of the 3 years, you get your principal back plus whatever the kicker happens to be. It can be more, it can be less. The projects I looked at, it's been at least what they projected and often a few ticks more.
Yeah, and those are really interesting to take a look at. I know there's a lot of programs that are run like that for if somebody's got an RSP, they can move it into that type of investment vehicle, or if in the States they've got was it IROC or whatever it is that they have out there, whatever the US equivalent is. they can move into those investment vehicles and just treat it as like a self-directed or what have you. And I think that's a wonderful mechanism because, again, passive is passive. It's just, it's like anything greater than zero is not zero. And so if you have to spend a proportion, no matter how small, it's not passive.
Right. And that comes back to the spreadsheet. Even if it's a local project or property that you can manage yourself, you should always budget out for paying a property manager. Why? Oh, you don't want to deal with the stuff for starters. People will often ask me, should I do my own bookkeeping for my business? I say once or twice so you know what's going on, and then outsource it. Why? Well, are you going to do it for anyone else? No. Then why would you want to give it to someone or not give it to someone who does it every day instead of struggle with it once a year or once a month yourself? Same thing with property management. If something goes wrong, something breaks down, do you know who to call? A property manager has numbers of already set to go. Oh, I need an electrician, I call this guy. I need a plumber, I call that guy. And they can often get better deals than you can, say, buying appliances, because if they're managing a building, they'll buy for the building, not just one unit. So
Yeah, it's so critically important, and I think you hit the nail on the head. If you do something once a year, how could you consider yourself a professional? It's like there's real estate agents out there that I think any person who's going to go deal with a real estate agent, just say, how many deals have you done in the last 6 months? How many transactions have you done? How many have you
yeah,
done in the last year? And if you haven't done any, why am I going to be your guinea pig? And the same thing applies with your bookkeeping is if you're not in tune with what you're doing with that, you got to find somebody who's going to be doing that job on a daily basis. If it comes to fixing your siding or fixing the plumbing, you're going to go in, you're going to be frustrated because that one tool that you need, you don't have, and you got to go out and buy it. You don't have the truck that's set up with everything in there with all the fittings that you need, and you need a 3/8, not a 5/8. And so now you're going out and shopping for one bolt, and you thought you had the right thing. Meanwhile, the other person comes in and just gets the job done. And I think most people don't value their time as they do value currency.
that's it.
And I think the most important thing to think is, poor people spend time for money where wealthy people spend money for time.
That's it. Yeah. And you say about the tool thing, that is so true. I was trying to fix the drain on my kitchen sink and put a new drain in, and there's a plastic nut that you have to unscrew that's conveniently located behind the sink.
Yes.
So I had to squeeze myself into the little compartment underneath the sink, reach behind the sink, and you have about this much to grab. There's almost no leverage. Then I find out there's a plumbing tool that has grooves, like U-shaped grooves,
Mm-hmm.
that will
Yep.
exactly catch the threads on that nut. And instead of trying to torque your hand like this, it's about 8 to 10 inches long. So now you're turning it down here and you have leverage. But without that specific tool, the job's a nightmare.
Well, and a lot of times you'll see, and this is a horrible generality, but you see these very large, burly plumbers, and you're like, how could that large, burly plumber get into that small little spaces and contortionist when I can't fit in there? And it's because they have the right tool for the right job, and they know how to do it because they've done it 1,000 times. So get a professional, get the professional to do the job, and use your time. But then when you have the time, use your time wisely and go do something that's important and meaningful, whether that's spending time with your kids or generating more revenue for your business. Go do something important.
I had to replace my dishwasher and I thought about doing it myself. I said no. So I hired someone to do it, came in with his daughter, who was a large, strong girl, carried the new dishwasher in, carried the old dishwasher out. To my surprise, went down to the basement. I didn't know they had to go down the basement, but apparently there was some valve there they had to deal with. Whole thing was done in and out, probably an hour. And the bill was something that I made doing 45 minutes of consulting, which is
There you go.
way better use of my time because I do consulting all the time. I'm used to it. Whereas this thing, I'd literally never done it before. It would have taken me the whole day. Would have been extremely frustrating because I would have got to a certain point and said, why is it not working? Oh, there's a valve in the basement that you've got to deal with. I didn't know, but they did because they do it all the time.
Well, just like real estate, when you're investing in real estate, look at the highest use for the real estate and see how you can drive that forced appreciation to get to the highest use. The same thing applies with your time, is look at how you can drive that to the highest use.
Absolutely. That's the one thing that we have the same amount of, right? 24 hours in a day. How you use it is up to you.
Yeah, and you can triple the amount of hours you have in a day. Like everybody says, I only have 24 hours in a day. I disagree. I could have 2,400 hours in a day. And the way that I do that is through leverage. Is if I can have technology leverage, I can save time. If I have a team leverage, I can save time. And every time I outsource that time, that's buying my time back. So I could buy back 24 hours of time in one day.
Sure.
And that's leverage.
Absolutely.
Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, man. We could talk for hours and keep on going because I think this is a topic both you and I are very passionate about. And I think you were so passionate that you did write your book, A to Zen Real Estate. And I think that for anybody who is looking at investing in real estate, it's a wonderful book to take a look at and definitely get there. And as you said it, you know, and one of your things is surround yourself with a team because real estate is a people business. And guys, if you're looking for something that you want to get some advice on investing in the US as a Canadian, reach out to Michael and his details will be there. AskMichael.ca is actually, it's pretty simple. You can look that one up really easily and then find him there.
That's right. And they can always just reach out by email. It's Michael.
Beautiful. And guys, this is the money. This is the mindset. This is the mentoring podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye now.